Hi, it's Moser with a quick tutorial on cells and energy. This is the short version. So, after this video, you should be able to explain why all cells need energy and describe the ways in which cells get energy, as well as the conditions under which cells will use which chemical processes. You should also be able to identify the products and reactants of each of the common reactions that cells use for energy. You should already know what autotrophs and heterotrophs are, as well as your basic cell structures. Let's go. You know that every living thing is made up of cells. Some living things, like prokaryotes, are single-celled. There's a prokaryote with a nice little single chromosome, circular strand of DNA, a few ribosomes, maybe some cilia. Nothing fancy. And then we've got the more interesting, or more complicated anyway, eukaryotes, both animal and plant cells, with all their membrane-bound organelles, nuclei, and endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, mitochondria, Golgi bodies, and in plants we'll add to that list chloroplasts and vacuoles and a cell wall. Pretty cool stuff. So whether those cells are in an autotroph or a heterotroph, a plant or an animal, fungus, or protist, they got stuff to do. They got jobs to do. They got things to accomplish. They are making chemicals, packaging chemicals, exporting chemicals, importing chemicals, transporting substances, expanding, contracting, reproducing. There's a lot going on here. Cells have got a lot of things to do. And what does it take to get those things done? Well, no matter where those cells are or what they look like, the thing that they all need to do to get the job done is energy! And for cells, that energy comes in the form of ATP. ATP is a nifty little molecule that all cells everywhere, whether they're prokaryote or eukaryote, autotroph cells or heterotroph cells, use for energy. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, but you don't really need to know that. So where do we get ATP? So where do cells get ATP? Where do you get ATP? Is it in your food? Can you go out and eat a nice big plate of food that contains tons of ATP? Do pineapples have it? Is it present in potatoes? Where do we get this stuff? The fact is that cells have to make their own ATP. And to make ATP, cells need a molecule called glucose. Now, glucose is a simple sugar. It's actually the simplest sugar there is, C6H12O6. You may have seen glucose tablets. Why people might need glucose tablets is a whole different story. But you don't normally just ingest glucose. So, to make glucose, your body needs carbohydrates. And where do you get those? Pasta, bread, plain old sugar. Those are all sources of carbohydrates that your body can break down to form glucose, and then use that glucose to make the ATP that serves as gasoline for your cells and their busy, busy day. So let's talk about those carbohydrates. Said one cell to another, "Where'd you get those carbohydrates?" "I ate them." So who's that speaking? That's an autotroph. Autotrophs can't make their own food, so they are forced to get food from other organisms. But what about this lovely little cell here? What about you? Where'd you get your carbs? The heterotroph says, "I made them myself." The making them themselves, that photosynthesis, that's a whole nother video. Photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. That'll be the next one. Okay, so we know that one way or another, we've got glucose that we're going to turn into ATP. And the process by which we do that is cellular respiration. So obviously the word cellular means that this is happening in cells. What about respiration? You've probably heard this word before, and you may associate it with breathing. Well, that's because the breathing that you and lots of other organisms do gets the chemicals into your body that your cells are going to need to perform this all-important chemical reaction called cellular respiration. So all organisms perform cellular respiration. In prokaryotes, like this little bacteria here, the cellular respiration happens in the cytosol of the cell. That's the juicy part. In eukaryotes, like this lovely animal cell or lovely plant cell, Cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. Perhaps you remember the mighty mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell? That's why. So, while all organisms perform cellular respiration, there are a couple different ways to get the job done. And the first question is always, is there oxygen? If the answer to that is yes, there is oxygen, then the cell will perform what's called aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen. If the answer to that is no, there is no oxygen, then the cell will perform what is called anaerobic cellular respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And anaerobic cellular respiration is also called fermentation. So to look at aerobic cellular respiration, the kind of cellular respiration that happens when oxygen is present, we want to look at the chemical equation because this is a chemical process. Aerobic cellular respiration takes glucose, that's that simple sugar, C6H12O6, combines it with oxygen, and out of that gets CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, or water, and energy. And what form does energy for our cells take? ATP. And aerobic cellular respiration produces loads of ATP, lots and lots and lots and lots of energy. This is good for cells. But what about those cases when the answer to the question, is there oxygen, is no, and we have to do anaerobic cellular respiration? Well, there are two pathways, depending on what kind of organism we're talking about. Alcoholic fermentation is performed by yeasts and some bacteria. Lactic acid fermentation is performed by bacteria and some animal cells. So alcoholic fermentation, the kind of fermentation performed by yeasts and some bacteria, again, takes C6H12O6, that's the glucose molecule, but it doesn't have any oxygen to combine it with. So the yeast or bacteria just take that glucose molecule and they break it down to produce alcohol, carbon dioxide, and energy. What forms the energy in? Right, ATP. Except there's a problem. Alcoholic fermentation only produces a tiny amount of ATP. Not ideal, but for these guys, these yeasts, and that is in fact a picture of live yeasts, it's their best pathway to getting ATP. It's, some ATP is better than none. Now, humans have used yeast and bacteria that perform alcoholic fermentation for tens of thousands of years. And we use it to brew alcohol, we use it to make bread, we actually use it to do a few other things. But these are all performed by yeasts. You can walk into the store and buy a packet of the kinds of yeasts that will perform alcoholic fermentation. Easy peasy. So they're doing it for their purposes, but, well, we've sort of kept them as, we could call them tiny wildlife. What about lactic acid fermentation? This is a form of cellular respiration performed without oxygen by bacteria and some animal cells. So those cells are able to take glucose, C6H12O6, and break it down, producing lactic acid as a byproduct, and energy. Energy in what form? Right, ATP. Unfortunately, just a little bit of ATP. Kind of like alcoholic fermentation, lactic acid fermentation is not going to get a cell a lot of ATP, but some ATP is better than no ATP. These are actually some of the kinds of cells that perform lactic acid fermentation on a regular basis. This is a species of bacteria that you have probably had contact with. It's a species of bacteria that humans have been keeping as, wildlife? Pets? Livestock? I'm not sure what, but we've been keeping them and raising them and passing them on for 10,000 years. This is Lactobacillus acidophilus, and it's the kind of bacteria that humans use to make yogurt. If you go into the grocery store and pick up a carton of yogurt, you'll see that it usually says contains live cultures, and it will list several species of bacteria. This is one of them. That lactic acid they produce is what gives yogurt its tart flavor. What else do we use lactic acid to produce? Cheese. All kinds of cheeses. Different species of bacteria give each cheese its distinctive flavor. What else? Well, sauerkraut, one of my favorite things, but also sour cream and soy sauce and a whole bunch of other fermented and pickled foods. Pretty cool. But wait, I said animal cells could do lactic acid fermentation too. Like your cells? My cells? Yeah, your cells and my cells. You may have experienced what happens when your cells are forced to perform lactic acid fermentation. If you've run really hard or played really hard, and your muscle cells have been deprived of oxygen because you just can't breathe in enough oxygen to meet the demands you're placing on those cells. You may have felt a burning, stinging sensation in your muscles. A muscle cramp? Yeah. That muscle cramp is actually the result of your cells performing lactic acid fermentation. And as lactic acid builds up in your cells, well, it hurts. All right, quick overview review. With oxygen, lots of kinds of cells can perform aerobic cellular respiration, where they take glucose, C6H12O6, combine it with oxygen, and out of that create energy in the form of ATP, and as a byproduct, create CO2 and water. If there's no oxygen to be had, however, cells are forced to choose, and depending on what type of organism or what type of cell we're talking about, they'll either perform alcoholic fermentation, where they take that C6H12O6, the glucose molecule, and break it down, forming alcohol, CO2, and energy, or lactic acid fermentation, where they break down the glucose, forming lactic acid and a little bit of energy. Remember that neither of the fermentation processes produce a lot of energy for the cell, so most cells that have a choice will perform aerobic cellular respiration. Okay, can you explain why all cells need energy? Can you describe the ways in which cells get energy and under what conditions they'll use which process? Can you identify the products and reactants of each of the common reactions that cells use for energy? If so, you're good.